Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. For those that weren't online this morning, my name's Tony Shillaby. I'm a Regional Director in Community Corrections in SA. I'm the South Australian Sub-Delegate and the National Vice President of PACCOA. It is with great pleasure that I introduce the Section 68 Life Sentence Parole Case Management Team here from South Australia. So today there will be 4 people presenting this session, and I'll just go through them. Rachel Dobson is a Senior Case Manager in Community Corrections who has over 14 years experience in Community Corrections case management, mainly supervising the highest risk offenders out there in the community. With Rachel is Sally Reese, a Senior Social Worker at the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre, and Sally's got previous experience working both within the Community Corrections context and also in a custodial environment. Joining those two are Lachlan Wilderspin and James Rudder. Both are custodial case management coordinators at the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre. So together, Sally, Lachlan and James are members of the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre case management team, and between them, they've got over 60 years of combined experience working and dealing with prisoners and offenders transitioning into the community. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to mention James Rudder. In 2020 on the Queen's Birthday Honours List, James was awarded the Australian Corrections Medal for his service to corrections for over 30 years. So we've got quite a high level of experience, skills and knowledge presenting this session. So I'll just hand over to the team.
Thank you, Tony. Today, we're going to share our experiences in providing a specialist and collaborative case management involving both community corrections and the institution in the supervision of life sentence prisoners who are released to parole. Given the nature of this offence, this particular cohort often catch the political and community's attention, and thus our team's approach needs to be both transparent and accountable in how we deliver our supervision. Firstly, I think it's important to give some brief history to the creation of our case management function for this offender. Okay, so pre-2015, the parole application process for life sentence prisoners was lengthy and drawn out. When a life sentence prisoner was eligible to apply for parole, their application not only had to be considered and recommended by the South Australian Parole Board, but it also had to be tabled and then considered by the Executive Council government. There was no defined timeframe for when this application would be considered by the Executive Council, and when a decision was made, there was no requirement by the Executive Council to advise of any reasons behind their decision. The process and decision-making, I think it's fair to say, had some political influence. There was a Rackham and Packham stance or view by the then government party, and despite the Parole Board's risk analysis and the proposed management of the parole release, not many life sentence prisoners were actually released, and there was no reasons for the refusal provided. This ultimately had a wider impact. It created a feeling of hopelessness and unrest within the lifer population, and not to mention created a mass backlog of prisoners who had now exceeded their earliest release date, in many cases by many years. In 2015, legislation was passed through changing this process for release and essentially giving back full determination of release to the Parole Board. The process became more transparent in that when recommending release, the Parole Board would issue a reasons for release document that was published and made available to key stakeholders, say Parole, Attorney General and the Commissioner for Victims' Rights, who may have concerns or wish to add conditions to the release could do so within a defined period of time. That period of time was 60 days. This change in process has resulted in the release of life sentence prisoners being a reality. The release to parole is for life, and in particular, a significant condition was imposed. that upon your release, you reside at the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre, APC, in accordance with the provisions of Section 68 1BI of the Correctional Services Act 1982 for a period of up to 12 months or until alternative release accommodation is approved by the Parole Board. This is candidly known as Section 68 parole. So now we have a parolee who is to reside in a prison.
I didn't find who's to reside.
So the approved facility in this case was the nominated was the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre, which is it's a low security institution for up to 60 male prisoners and 24 female prisoners. The APC has been operational for approximately 37 years, and the APC is one of the 9 gazetted South Australian prisons. It's designed as a graduated community release program where prisoners are eligible to transfer to up to their last 2 years of their non-parole period. The design of the APC is to mimic independent living through a normalisation process under the principles of case management, and it fosters an atmosphere of mutual respect, with the prisoners having an active role and responsibility in their own reintegration process. The centre concentrates on developing independent living skills via self-contained cottage accommodation. The cottages are an open plan style with a shared kitchen and living area. The program ethos promotes individualised reintegration plans, a focus on family connection, employment, education and training, accommodation, budgeting, including the establishing of resettlement savings and pro-social community connection and engagement. Residents are required to prepare and live within a weekly budget and are responsible for their own cooking and laundry. Previous assessments of the recidivism or rate of return for offenders released from the APC were only 15 in 100 compared to the state average of 30. And currently we're in the process of gaining a new rate of return, but now with the introduction of Section 68, we're in the process of gaining a new rate of return, but have held the review until the free movement of the community as a result of COVID, because we want to correctly measure the current rate. We considered that the introduction of Section 68 was one of the most significant changes in the correctional management of offenders in relation to the transition from prison to community. Simply, it was how were parolees going to be managed and reside within a prison. Some of the issues considered were, how do we identify a Section 68 parolee on our electronic systems? We needed to define clear delegation and description of all operational and case management responsibilities, and how to manage any medical or social needs, including any possible incidents. So as a result, a standard operating procedure, or SOP 40, was developed from extensive consultation from both the APC and community corrections, which took a lot of it did take a lot of learning on both sides as to the operations and how to make a cohesive program that met the requirements of both a secure institution and a community-based service. Currently, the APC has 9 parolees, or Section 68 parolees, residing there, and this is made up of 7 males and 2 females, which are all included on the overall institution count. And if you look at this photo here, inside the yellow boundary is actually the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre. It's 2 gazetted prisons. The Adelaide Women's Prison, it adjoins on one side, and the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre is just inside the yellow there on the left. Also, this is a typical photograph of one of the accommodation units that 4 people can reside in, along with the Section 68 parolees.
So who's involved? We have the Section 68 parolee, the community corrections, in this case, North East Community Correctional Centre, with the Senior Case Manager being Rachel Dobson. The APC Case Management Team, the social worker, myself, Sally Reeks, Custodial Case Management Coordinators, James Rudder and Lachlan Wilderspin. We also have the Parole Board, DCS Executive, the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre Management and Staff, and Victim Services.
So how do we make this work? Probably the most important thing is communication. This program requires a high level of targeted and timely communication between the key individuals involved, namely the parolee, the CCO being myself, the CMCs and the social worker, parole board, relevant management and victim services. Lifers are a cohort of offenders who have a high level of interest and scrutiny upon them, which of course is required, and rightly so. As such, all stakeholders need to be on the same page to ensure consistent practice across the program. A sound level of understanding is required as to each other's roles, and boundaries are then determined by this. For example, all breaches are required to be actioned by myself as the CCO, even if it's related to prison-based matters such as the introduction of contraband. The team has been kept small and deliberately allocated all parolees to the one CCO. This was done deliberately to ensure consistency in decision-making and easy points of contact. The lead case management role is undertaken by myself as the CCO, given that we are speaking about parolees. Parolees are aware that their supervision is undertaken by the team, and they cannot split between the community and the custodial staff. This team approach is made clear from the very outset of their parole. On the day of release, I attended the APC for an initial parole intake. This is undertaken with all four of us present, along with the parolee, and it allows for and establishes unity from the outset. It also ensures that everyone has the same understanding of individual conditions and allows for all questions to be answered at the same place at the same time with the same people, so there can be no differentiation later. From there on, after their initial intake, I undertake weekly supervision sessions with the parolees. Sally provides additional support around those sessions whilst the parolee is on site at the APC, whilst the CMCs meet with the parolee fortnightly in relation to operational issues, whilst also providing a further avenue for generalised support. It's noted that as a team, we always maintain open communication behind the scenes. We all know what each other is doing, when and why. This ensures consistent messages to the parolee across the whole team. So effectively, they could ask any one of us the same question and receive the same answer every time. Sally, James and I have been involved in the Section 68 program since its inception, with Lockie joining as a permanent member 12 months ago. As a group, we hold specialised knowledge about the legislation, program and how it operates, which can be attributed to its success as we've remained constants. It's really important to note here that long-term prisoners, such as lifers, appreciate consistency and transparency, particularly in a time that can be quite overwhelming for them in terms of moving from a secure custodial environment into the community.
Movement in and out of the institution obviously creates an increased security risk. Parolees are permitted to come and go from the institution as they please within their designated curfew times, which in turn increases security pressures on institutional staff who are required to monitor their movements for institutional counts and general operational requirements. As mentioned, due to increased security movement in and out of the institution, there is a possibility of increased risk of the introduction of contraband, including mobile phones and other prohibited electrical items, non-prescribed medications, illicit drugs, as well as excess clothing and food items. Parolees can sometimes become complacent or frustrated with having to continue to follow prison or prisoner rules inside the institution, even though they are technically a parolee. Any non-compliance on centre is managed accordingly as per SOP 40, ensuring that the primary case officer, the CCO, is informed of any breaches and behavioural concerns. Our duty of care and appropriate use of force requires continued staff training and awareness of their delegations relating to the procedures of managing Section 68 parolees within the prison setting. With a Section 68, as well as all prisoners, the use of force is considered to be the last resort. However, the standard operating procedure, or SOP 40, provides provisions for it to be used in circumstances where other options cannot be used effectively. As a CMC, part of our role is to ensure that all other relevant prison staff are across the Section 68 parolee process, relating to their conditions and curfew times, which can vary from one parolee to another. As such, it is required that all communication is targeted and timely to ensure the smooth running of the institution for all staff, prisoners and parolees. CMCs are also a key part in bridging the gap between the us and them mentality. Whilst we wear blue shirts, we also fully support and promote the case management process to ultimately achieve a seamless transition and reintegration back into the community.
Challenges for community corrections. As has been mentioned before, lead case management sits with the CCO, being myself, as the parolee. Well, the offender is a parolee who's required to live in a prison. Case management of lifers can look quite different to that of a normal parolee and requiring many hats to be worn. It's complex and can comprise anything from teaching parolees how to use their electronic devices such as smartphones, setting up email addresses and MyGov accounts, helping them interact with internet banking based applications, and then all the way through to brief interventions, counselling, referrals, and then of course compliance management such as urine testing. The CCO role can be seen in many different ways and is essentially the bridge between the secure prison environment and the community. This requires the breaking down of the us and them mentality that Lockie referred to before into working relationships that are built upon rapport building and trust. This is quite often achieved in providing support in ways the offenders don't expect, with feedback being that it's the little things that we do in terms of assisting them with their phones, setting up their MyGov accounts and their Centrelink that builds the most rapport the quickest and gains that level of trust that we actually want them to succeed. Static security. In the community, we know it's an ever-changing environment, and as such, the flexibility to manage some issues can be a challenge when dealing with static security requirements. What I may do in the community, I cannot always do within a prison environment, and that's something that we always need to be aware of. Further to this, prisons are 24/7 staffed environments. However, myself as the CCO is not available all the time. One of the challenges that presents is the need to be ahead of or on top of problems before they occur to try and ensure that we can deal with them within the more standard 9 to 5 hours. All breaches and parole communication is completed by myself, which requires ongoing liaison with the CMCs as to the operational requirements of what can and cannot occur within the prison. For example, this can be a direction for a parolee to remain on site pending a breach outcome and the execution of warrants within the prison. Challenges for the parolee. Probably the greatest challenge that parolees face is that of identity crisis. Am I a prisoner or am I a parolee? They live inside the fence line and are required to conduct themselves in line with prison expectations, such as presenting themselves for count, yet they can leave within their designated curfew hours and go about their daily business in the community without many restrictions. Parolees often find themselves confronted with the reality that they are no longer the person that they were at the time of their offence. However, they cannot be the prison version of themselves in the community, and as such need to develop who they are post-release. Differences in how to interact in the community versus the prison is another area of challenge. Communicating in prison differs to that of the community. And so parolees are challenged in learning how to use appropriate language and tone, etc., that is appropriate within a community environment. One of the biggest things that they speak of is when they're interacting with services, they're quite direct and upfront about things, which for people who aren't working within the criminal justice system on a daily basis can be perceived as aggressive or intimidating behaviour. Whereas for the prisoner themselves, it's how you need to communicate to get by. So they need to relearn some of those skills. They're also challenged by the feelings of not wanting to leave the institution initially due to fear of the unknown and expectations not being met. For example, prisoners spend a long time thinking about what their release might look like, as do their families. However, they quite often find that when they're released, those expectations don't always match, which can be quite a challenge for them. There's also the sensation of being what I call in a washing machine in the community. Coming from a regimented and structured environment, parolees are then thrown into the community in which they're required to make all kinds of decisions that they haven't had to for the last potentially 20 years, which also presents its own challenges. This is then in contrast to the desire for them not to want to return to the prison as time goes on their Section 68, as they find that returning to the prison no longer aligns with how they see themselves within the community environment. A further challenge for the parolees is that of being reconfronted with their offence and the gravity of it, be it through the realisation that they are out living their lives again and their victims cannot, media attention associated with their release, or the requirement to explain their criminal history to those in the community that are not involved with the criminal justice system, such as other service providers, friendships, or in fact, even building relationships and the challenges that that presents for them.
Another stinger is payment of board. So all Section 68 parolees are expected to pay board of $175 per week. Majority, as we have at the moment, are employed. However, they are eligible for Centrelink and rent assistance if they don't. Being free is a challenge too. Community reintegration and the juggling of everyday life. Prisoners now, parolees now have to get their heads around the ideas of paying bills, making new social circles, navigating systems they're not familiar with, such as Centrelink, technology, and even the use of public transport.
Having access to the community readily creates pressures from other inmates to bring back items into the prison, contraband and excess food items. Ensuring parolees are remembering the need to adhere to prison rules when in the prison and essentially having their freedom removed again when they return each night. And also how to manage that when presented with officers who may have reduced levels of understanding or exposure to these situations.
Trial and trial again. Utopia. If we were in a utopia, this Section 68 would be provided in a standalone, separated, approved facility, not within a prison setting. This could allow for still the increased monitoring and access to the support of the social worker and a CCO, but without the added pressures of still being in a prison environment.
Risk-based decision-making may not always align between custodial and community. For example, custodial staff cannot manage a breach of a prisoner rules in the same way that they would with a prisoner when they're actually a parolee, which over time has required ongoing learning and adapting from experiences due to the dynamic nature of the program. COVID-19 has also had parolees restricted when the wider community wasn't, simply due to their increased movement. They are committed and the potential risk that this creates the security environment. The need to lock down beyond that of the wider community almost feels like a regression and can have implications with employees and finances. We have tried to reduce such impacts by removing board payments for weeks that we were previously locked down. We have also allowed access to mobile phones in a controlled way to keep loved ones and employees informed. And the use of technology has allowed us to conduct supervision with the CCO via Zoom as a group.
Success. Now that we've spoken about the challenges, what has been our successes? We have successfully achieved a blended case management approach between custodial and community, whilst also building complex engagement with community services such as mental health, work skill, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. On average, parolees remain at the APC as a Section 68 parolee for approximately 6 months, dependent upon the supports they have in place, accommodation options, and employment. We are really careful to ensure that parolees are released into appropriate accommodation and set up for success from the outset. For example, when we're assessing appropriate accommodation in the community, we're really careful to ensure that we're not mimicking a cell-based environment within the community. With that said, what we look for is where we can standalone accommodation that has more than one entry exit point and potentially a garden. This prevents parolees then moving out into a community into a small unit that might be high density with only one entry exit point, which is very similar to their custodial accommodations. Once they've been released from Section 68 onto full parole, I will maintain the supervision of the file where able to ensure the ongoing support and consistency as they complete their reintegration before then transferring the file to another CCO.
This program of Section 68 has been in place since 2016 and has successfully transitioned out 43 parolees to the community, with the 44th to occur on Monday week. Most of these have been actually employed in the community, And the ones who have not, perhaps is because of their age and or they've been in receipt of NDIS support and been placed on a disability support pension. The Section 68 case management team have been formally recognised by our Department for Correctional Services in providing a quality and comprehensive case management service to life sentence parolees with the consideration of victims' issues and the safety of the community, which we are proud of. The next slide we've just managed to get some comments from a couple of successful Section 68 parolees who are now being released to full parole and their thoughts on the program. I can say that both of these have successfully reintegrated to the community without any recorded breaches or concerns raised since.
Thank you very much for the Section 68 team there. Thoroughly interested. I do want to ask before I let you guys go, or before we go into question and answers, if just each of you guys could tell us maybe your favourite part about the program, something that you really take from it.
I think for me, it's the ability to be able to work with a team that ordinarily before this program came on board, I wouldn't have. So obviously I work out in a community correctional centre, whereas these guys work over at the APC. So we get that really close teamwork, even though we're on separate sites, which I think is great. And I think second to that, or probably more importantly, is the ability to transition people through probably one of the greatest parts of their life in terms of leaving a secure institution and then reintegrating into the community and being able to do that successfully and safely, both for them and the wider community. I think that's really rewarding.
Yeah, I think so. I think also from the institution's point of view, the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre's ethos since its inception, as I've mentioned before, has always been about that reintegration or that normalisation, transition back into community. And the introduction of this new part of the Act has really, it has been one of the most significant changes in regard to dealing with offenders transitioning. And we've got parolees actually residing and living back still in the prison. So, but it sort of really has given us, well, personally, but also I think for the unit and the people that want to work there, I'd reiterate what Rachel's saying, is that it's positive to formalise sort of that, you know, the corporate words, you know, that seamless transition, but it's true. This is a very good stepping stone for them to be able to have pro-social things organised prior to getting out in a very graduated and controlled release. You know, it's just about us from a security point of view and these people being released, being comfortable, but it's also about the individual being comfortable as well. That sometimes they mark a date on their calendar and they can't wait for it, but when that date comes around, they realise, oh, hang on a minute, I might not be, or I'm not ready, or, you know, perhaps I think I am, but, you know, be careful what you wish for things. So we have a lot of people that are actually very grateful of this. You know, they're glad that they're actually been given an opportunity of having a date that they can work with and a process.
Awesome. Look, I'll bring Tony Shillabere back in and he can moderate some questions and answers. I can see we've got some questions coming in already, and I would encourage anyone else out there, hit us with your questions now. It's a great opportunity.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to the Section 68 team. I've been personally involved in this program right since its inception. It's one of the, I think, most remarkable programs I've seen for life sentence parolees in quite some time. Liz Moore in Tasmania, big shout out to Liz, has asked a question from someone with her. How many parolees have not yet successfully transitioned past their 12-month term, and do you expect that they eventually will? Sounds like a fantastic example of collaboration.
So off the top of my head, I think we have 3 or 5 that in their Section 68 time have unfortunately had to be returned to a more secure environment. 2 of those unfortunately have had their parole cancelled. The others are still potentially going to come back through the process. So they will go for a re-interview with the parole board and then potentially be re-released back to Section 68, and we will start the process again. I think our stats, Sally, you might know this a little bit better than I do, but the majority of the people that we've had come through Section 68 have successfully completed, even if it has taken them more than 1 attempt. And I think something that needs to be mentioned in the context of this is that the Section 68 parolees, as much as they're accountable to themselves and each other, to us, they're actually accountable to each other. The successfulness of the program will only work and continue to work based on how they go themselves. And so there is a level of, we've got it at the moment with a number of Aboriginal lifers where they're kind of mentoring each other through the process. And so their accountability to each other to be successful is actually, you know, quite a nice thing to see also.
Thank you. There's a couple more online questions for you folk. Has there been any community backlash with the idea that they are getting out early and not serving the sentence as it was titled for life?
Anything come through?
No.
Nothing, not as a whole in terms of the program, no. Individual parolees, yes, there's been a couple that have received quite a significant amount of media attention due to the, I guess, the nature of their crime. But the program as a whole hasn't received any negative media attention that I'm aware of.
No.
Okay, thanks. Another question, online question. Can you talk about how does this program compare to release for other parolees who might have spent a long time inside, you know, that is not a lifer?
Look, the APC, as I mentioned, the ethos of it is where prisoners to transfer, where the world has changed a little bit for them. So meaning that ideally that they've been sentenced for at least 3 to 5 years plus. And obviously if they're not a life sentence prisoner, then obviously the world has changed a little bit. So our programs are set up, as we spoke about before, to be able to help them gradually, you know, undertake reintegration back into the community. Some prisoners, non-life sentence prisoners, this might answer it a bit better. In recent times, I've actually said that to the parole board, look, I'm not ready to be released. I don't feel like I'm ready. My conditional release date is up, and yes, obviously the parole board are endorsing it. However, they've actually requested that they continue on at the pre-release centre in order to be able to establish some more pro-social stuff. So, you know, to gain paid employment and just get those simple grassroots stuff established. So I guess that's in a sense similar to the Section 68 opportunity, where they still have a base, if you like, to be able to fall back to in order to give them time to be able to create or find housing and employment, etc.
I think for some longer term prisoners, if they don't get the opportunity to go to the APC, they will be released without this effective stepping stone that Section 68 provides. So a Section 68 parolee has all the, I guess, freedom of a normal parolee during the day between the hours of 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. That's a standard curfew. However, they have the security of then being able to return back to the custodial environment at night, which in the initial stages of their release is where they're most comfortable. So I think it alleviates in that feelings of being really overwhelmed, and a few of them have referred to the case of kind of being, I just got turfed out, whereas Section 68 bridges that gap that other long-term prisoners that aren't lifers or that haven't had the opportunity to go to APC, they don't get that same level of, I guess, step down reintegration.
Thank you. And there's another online question. Are victims of crime included in the decision-making process for the program? And Rachel, you might better answer the second part of the question. How are victim considerations managed? And you can probably talk about the the exclusion zones within the parole conditions.
Yeah, so in the very first part of this presentation, Sally referred to the decisions being
application process.
Yeah, the process. So once the decision to release a life sentence prisoner has been made by the parole board, there's reasons for a release written up, and they are sent to the Attorney General, Victim for Commissioners' Rights and South Australian Police, who have 60 days in which they can make submissions to the board regarding that release. If there's no significant things that come out of that, they can then progress to release. If there are submissions made in terms of victims, one of the conditions that quite often comes up is exclusion zones, in which a parolee will be excluded from entering into certain, sometimes suburbs, but sometimes it's multiple suburbs and whole areas of the South Australian community, and we can monitor that via electronic monitoring. There's also generally a standard condition that parolees are not to attempt or to contact or attempt to contact or associate in any way, whether directly or indirectly, with the victims of their offence or their families. So those conditions are built in terms of victims' input. In terms of when we're engaging around exclusion zones, I have regular contact with the Victim Services Unit, and that includes when we're also looking for release addresses. So as part of a course, we make contacts with Victim Services Unit and provide them with the proposed address, and they then can provide me with submissions and advice back as to whether it's an appropriate address or if they would like some additional exclusion zones or conditions recommended on that release.
Thank you. And if there's no more other online questions, I've probably just got one I wanted to ask the group just generally. Well, a couple of questions actually. Do all lifers, once they're released on the parole, go onto this program? And secondly, in South Australia, life means life. The legislation changed a few years ago. Previously, a life parole was 10 years. And I'm just wondering, from the team's experience now, what's the mindset of these parolees being released when they know, and I know in one of your examples there, the first male was released at 35. I mean, he could potentially be on parole for 30, 40, maybe 50 years. What's their mindset like, you know, having that reality in their face that they're going to be under, you know, release order conditions for the rest of their natural life?
To answer your very first part, Tony, since the program came on board in 2016, as far as I'm aware, every life sentence prisoner has passed through Section 68. I don't think I've seen a lifer without that condition, unless they're a lifer who is subject to deportation, and then obviously they go straight into Australian Border Force custody. The second part of the question, do you guys want to answer?
I think most of the Section 68 parolees, they understand that they will be on parole for life. And I think most initially accept that because they realise that's their way to get out to the community. I guess time will tell down the track if that's acceptance is still something that's in their mind thinking.
I think it's probably important to note that whilst they'll be subject to life like conditions, that they can progress. So, you know, at the start of their orders, they will be reporting weekly and obviously living in the prison. They then move into the community, they still report weekly, but then they can progress to fortnightly, monthly reporting. So those restrictions, I guess, as they move through and are still compliant, will become less imposing upon them. But given that the program's only been in place for 5 or 6 years, we haven't had anyone, I guess, reaching those really long points of parole to know what that looks like in the future. And I think that'll be, you know, just further development for us as the program continues.
Well, thank you very much, guys. That's all the questions that we've
Tony,
got.
Tony, I think there's one from Queensland Conference Room. It's got their hand up.
Okay, I can't see it. Can you, Queensland, if you are online, feel free to ask away.
Hi everyone. I don't know whether it's a little bit outside of your scope, but I guess I was just wondering if there's scope for it in the future. I'm just noticing personally higher and higher prevalence of prisoners that have essentially been inside for at least 10 years. They may have had the opportunity to be released perhaps 6 times in that 10 years, but they're out for between 2 to 8 weeks at a max. And so I'm just wondering if there's future scope to perhaps those prisoners that have had that long-term incarceration had repeated unsuccessful attempts. I feel like they would significantly benefit from that, because that's usually what breaks down pretty immediately for them and ends them back up incarcerated.
I think at the moment, the Section 68 just applies to life sentence prisoners.
Yeah.
But I guess it certainly has its merits if it were to be to other long-term recidivists who have difficulties in their reintegration back to the community. The Adelaide Pre-Release Centre does host prisoners who ideally have had long stretches of imprisonment and or have had difficulties with reintegration back to the community. However, obviously there's a eligibility and criteria to proceed to having a placement at the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre.
Yeah.
I just had a quick question, Sally. You've talked about utopia and having a purpose-built, I guess, place for this program. Is it on the cards at some time in the future for the South Australia budget for that to happen?
I'm not aware of.
Tony?
I don't, Tony?
If it was in my remit, absolutely. But I think the probably if there's any limitations to the Section 68 program, it's probably the infrastructure within the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre now. Like as Sally talks about that utopia, it would be wonderful to have a facility that's separate and distinct from the prison, that they parolees being released from the prison, if you could virtually draw a line in the sand that they are no longer a prisoner, they are now on parole and they have no interaction or contact with prisoners, really I think defines and delineates them from being a prisoner. So perhaps that utopia may happen one day, and we're all, we'll live in hope. But certainly, I think the success of the 68 program now for about 6 years, hopefully can influence the government that investure in such a facility goes a long way to again reduce recidivism, by this cohort and other long-term prisoners. Thank you all, and thank you to the Section 68 team for giving up their time today. As I said, I'm very, very proud of this program. I'm very proud of the individuals involved in the program, and it was great to share their experience and their knowledge around Australia. So Dan, I'll just throw back to you.